Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone from wherever you're joining us today. My name is Ashok Gupta, Senior Researcher at the Pacific Institute and CEO of Mandate. Currently joining from London, we are honored to be here to be a part of the Water Pavilion at COP26 on behalf of the project partners, Alliance for Global Water Adaptation, International Water Management Institute, Pacific Institute, and CEO Water Mandate. I would like to welcome you to this session titled Preventing Shocks and Stresses from Becoming Crises, Water Resilience Assessment Framework. Just a quick one, if the folks at the pavilion can hear me well, and if we are online, just let us know by chat function in the YouTube chat window or from wherever you are joining from. This session presents one of our flagship projects, coordinated by CEO Water Mandate, collaboratively with project partners, AGWA, WRI, IMI. The project is co-funded by BHP, supported by Swiss Development Corporation, and other CEO Water Mandate endorsing companies. The project started in 2019. Recently at Stockholm World Water Week this year, we published the Core Water Resilience Assessment Framework. You can download the report and find other key project-related information from the links at the end of this session. The session is divided into distinct parts. The first part provides a brief overview and key features of the recently launched. The session is divided into distinct parts. The first part provides a brief overview and key features of the recently launched framework, an upcoming guidance document. That's the foundation of the discussion. And in the second part, we are hoping to have an engaging and lively panel discussion with key experts in the field of water resilience and climate change. The panel discussion will focus on, but not limited to, questions such as what is the relevance of WRAF in the context of climate change? WRAF is Water Resilience Assessment Framework. How do you see WRAF advancing resilience, the framework advancing resilience? How could we upscale it? How does it link to existing areas of work? For example, water risk assessment, water stewardship initiatives, and water targets, etc. The audience will have ample opportunities to ask questions using the chat function of the platform. If you have any specific question to one specific speaker or to the full panel, please let us know by indicating that in your question. As being a hybrid session, you will see some of us joining from the video link and others joining directly from the podium at Water Pavilion at COP26. Without further delay, I would like to welcome Kari Davis, Technical Director at AGWA, to present the General Water Resilience Assessment Framework. The floor is yours, Kari.
Great. Thank you so much, Ashok. As you said, my name is Kari Davis, and I'm the Technical Director at the Alliance for Global Water Adaptation, or AGWA. So before I dive into talking about the framework, I just want to take a step back and talk about why water resilience and why we decided to create a framework for assessing water resilience. As I'm sure all of you are aware, our world is changing, and it's changing faster than we anticipated. Climate change and other forces impact our water resources in known and unknown ways. And these changes can be gradual or sudden, and sometimes reversible, but often irreversible. A general business as usual approach could fail to respond to future uncertainties, and we need to think about new, innovative ways to run our critical infrastructure and services in order to build resilience to future shocks and stresses. The Water Resilience Assessment Framework, or WRAF, emerged from the need to help organizations build resilience. Overall, our aim is to stop shocks and stresses from becoming crises and to allow organizations to survive and thrive despite shifting conditions. The WRAF is designed to facilitate a shared understanding of water system resilience and allow practitioners to develop common measurable goals and outcomes for stakeholder and resilience planning. So shown on the next slide is the high-level WRAF framework. It was specifically designed to be applied to any stakeholder or sectoral perspective, and it is highly versatile. It is also not supposed to replace your existing water management practices or approaches, but instead to supplement them. It's an add-on that builds an additional water resilience layer. The WRAF shown here is composed of 4 steps. It describes a set of logical steps in determining system components and boundaries, selecting and developing resilient strategies and their implementable resilient actions, and testing the impact of the actions to enhance the resilience of the system. Finally, the framework provides a means to evaluate, and if needed, revise choices taken during the previous steps. The WRAF is an iterative process and is meant to be revised and revisited as the system changes, but also as you learn more about the system. Stakeholder engagement can also be included in the steps of the WRAF based on the organization and system needs. And a special effort should be made to engage with the stakeholders that have most impact on the water system, as well as those that are most impacted by the water system. Special attention should be paid to vulnerable and frequently overlooked communities as well. So I'm now going to walk through some of the aspects of the WRAF. There's obviously more that can be covered during this short presentation, so I encourage you to download the WRAF and look at it at a later date. So first, like many frameworks, the first step of the WRAF includes defining your system. What makes the WRAF different, though, is that the system can be larger or smaller than your organization or river basin. A system here is not just a basin or supply chain, but a set of interconnected socioeconomic, institutional governance, infrastructure management, and biophysical components that function as a whole. As these components can change over time, your system can also change over time, and it thus requires continual evaluation. For example, let's look at Mexico City's water supply network. So Mexico City faces simultaneous issues of floods and droughts. Water is supplied through a combination of groundwater and surface water sources, and the surface water is transferred from two nearby basins. So in the figure here, Mexico City is shown in pink, and the two basins where the water is transferred from are shown in green and gray, respectively. So if Mexico City was applying the WRAF, it would need to include not just the city, but as well as the two basins where water was transferred from within the system. So once you define the system, you can better understand how the system is changing. Some questions you need to ask are, how does water flow through the system now? And how are the flows changing, or how have they already changed? And how do these changes affect system services? What services, in fact, are also critical to the system function? So also included in the WRAF, we've looked at ways to analyze and categorize these changes. Next slide, please. Great, thank you. So one thing that's important here is the scale, direction, and longevity of the changes in a particular system and what they tell us that we need to do. So we need to look at if we need to prepare for continuity, gradual shifts, or abrupt transitions. So the WRAF groups challenges into three categories. The first of these is short-term disruptions. So short-term disruption is a temporary change that overall does not change the main conditions of the system. So as an example, the area I grew up in central Texas is normally very hot and dry. However, this past February, they experienced a very cold, sudden winter storm that totally shut down the city, including water and electricity. However, right after the storm, the utilities were able to bounce back to pre-storm conditions. And overall, there wasn't a significant change in the mean. So the next change is gradual long-term disruptions. So these are slow and predictable changes, such as climate impacts to water resources. We can watch these changes happening and predict them, and thus we can react. An example of this is the flow changes in the Colorado River Basin, which can be seen at the dam and reservoir levels that are dropping. So the last one is unpredictable sudden events. These, as the name says, are unpredictable and dynamically change the system itself. The system is no longer as it was, and many of these can't be predicted. So an example of this, even though slightly predicted, are widespread forest fires. Great, thanks. So the next step of the WRAF moves from assessing the system changes to choosing how to respond to these changes. We do this by selecting a resilience strategy. So a resilience strategy is a systematic approach to understanding and addressing drivers, shocks, and stresses impacting your system. And the type of strategy you select depends on the type of disruption expected to occur. So these three strategies directly correspond to the three types of disturbances in step one. So the first type strategy is persistence. Persistence is this business as usual scenario. So overall, the functions and processes of the system continue unchanged with only a brief interruption, and after the disturbance, it quickly returns to the pre-shock condition. The second strategy is adaptation. So adaptation generally just assumes that tomorrow will be different than today. But these changes are gradual and predictable, and successful adaptation means tracking these changes over time and taking the necessary actions to respond to these changes. The third is transformation, and transformation is a fundamental shift in the system or a significant change in the needs of the system. And transformation strategy requires reconsidering the fundamental aspects of an organization and its relationships with the operations. Transformation is significantly different than what you are doing today. So also, different strategies can be appropriate for different components of the system, and like the system boundaries may change over time. Therefore, additional monitoring is required, as I'll talk about later. So in order to operationalize the strategy, you need to do a few different steps. A strategy is just that, it's a strategy. And additional planning is required to turn it into actions. So the actions to support the strategy are selected based on a set of characteristics you deem important to the system, such as robustness or flexibility. Equity can also be considered here, and it should be considered here, in order to ensure that vulnerable populations are addressed in your actions. So after you select actions to support the goals of the resilience strategy, you then will select indicators so that you can further test these actions during a stress test. So step 3 is just that. It's a stress test of the system. Great, thank you. Here you're trying to see how well the actions support the resilience strategy, and then also how well the resilience strategy actually builds water resilience in the system. So stress testing helps us determine the relative impact and utility of the resilience actions under a range of plausible future scenarios. The stress test clarifies how well these actions respond to shocks and stresses, as well they effectively support the goals of the selected resilience strategy. The stress test can also be used to compare and evaluate different actions to determine which produce the most effective results. The WRAF does not prescribe a certain method for stress testing, and this is something that will further be discussed in the sector-specific guidance, which we'll talk about in a moment. Stress testing also really depends on the stakeholder capacity. Can you go back to the previous slide? Great, thanks. So just before we move on, just want to discuss a brief example of what stress testing can look like. So this is just one method, and there are many others, but this is an example that was developed by Poth et al. For the eco-engineering decision scaling approach. So they were looking at flood risk and ecological objectives, and they were testing different interventions under changing flow and rainfall patterns. So here you can see they tested 2 different actions under a range of different future scenarios. When they tested them, they found that the solutions worked well at the light blue zone, but not in the dark blue. So this is an example of a stress test you could use. But again, there are others. Next slide, please. So the final step in the WRAF is evaluation. Here, quite simply, you're just trying to ask if WRAF did succeed in building resilience, or did the stress test indicate that additional refinement is required? Again, this is normal, as I said, because the WRAF is an iterative process, and additional rounds of the WRAF are to be expected. So after you then implement the WRAF, you'd still have to continue to monitor and evaluate the system. So stakeholders are continued to continually evaluate how well the resilient strategies and resilient actions are actually seen in building resilience, or if additional actions are taken. The system can also change due to changing conditions, some predicted and unpredicted. So additional evaluations required. So we're now going to talk about more about what's coming next in the WRAF, so the sector-specific guidance, and move into the panel. So I'll pass it back to Ashok to conclude. Thanks. You are muted.
Mute. Is it all right now?
Yeah, that looks great.
Thank you, Kari. Thank you, Kari, for an excellent overview of the framework. As you mentioned, this is a relatively high-level framework that needs specific tailoring to suit different audiences. For this, we are developing 3 sector-specific guidance documents. First is to focus at corporates. Second one is to focus on for urban utilities. And the final guidance document is to focus on river authorities or basin planners in the coming weeks and months. To give you an idea of what is covered in such detailed guidance documents, I'd like to invite Colin Strong from WRI to highlight key features from the sector-specific guidance document focused at corporates. The floor is yours, Colin.
Thanks, Ashok. As mentioned, Colin Strong at the World Resources Institute, manager of corporate water stewardship. So the corporate guidance document is going to be the first sector-specific guidance document to come out. Of course, the intended audience is for businesses interested in actually applying this framework that Kari presented and at a specific location. A few key points that I want to point out. First is that a lot of really good work has been done in more traditional corporate water stewardship processes. The idea of this publication isn't so much to sort of replace any of that, but it's to add a resilience overlay and a resilience thinking on top of a lot of this really good thinking. So it's not wholly new, but really we're trying to complement what already exists and add just a little bit more information on what's new. So in terms of scoping, just a few points that are consistent with the corporate document and will likely be consistent with the other guidance documents as well. First of all, a lot of businesses have generally been traditionally looked within their four walls of a facility. One of the things that corporate water stewardship has been really good at is pushing businesses to think beyond their four walls and really start thinking about the wider system and landscape that they're operating in. That's been done and that's already happening, but the WRAF pushes this a bit further because really the objective of the WRAF is to explain, and for the corporate guidance, explain to a business, how does that business interact with and improve the resilience of the surrounding water system. If you're not operating within a resilient system, you may yourself have resilience issues. So we can imagine that it's really to the benefit of all businesses to ensure that the system around them is basically providing what it needs to them and other water users. So this is not about how does a business become resilient, it's about how does a business support the resilience of their surrounding system. And that's something we are pushing further than much of the corporate water stewardship work has been before. In terms of scale, this is a local and contextual work. If you are familiar with the Alliance for Water Stewardship Standard, or if you're familiar with the Contextual Water Target Guidance, which many are as it's related to Pacific Institute, CO Water Mandate, and other partners. That's the type of scale we're talking about, something that a business can take, they can take to their priority facilities and actually apply it at a local level. In addition, it's worth pointing out that corporate water stewardship has pushed heavily on stakeholder engagement to fulfill the needs of businesses and the greater community, and that's something that the WRAF will rely on a lot as well. So that's what it's building on in terms of what is new, what's changing for a business who's thinking about this. I would say the WRAF offers three new items. First of all, there's an emphasis upon new and additional types of information. I'll refer to them as resilience indicators. So for example, rather than looking at, say, pure water balance equations over the course of a year or over the course of months, it's important to start considering other aspects of your water resources that we haven't always thought about before, at least not in as structured a way. So for example, rather than just source input and amount, we should be thinking also about, let's say, water source diversity. Do you have, how many sources of water are there for the system you're operating in? What is the variability within those sources? What's the sort of hydrological characteristics of those sources? And how does that affect when water shows up, how water shows up at certain times? And what can you do to increase that ability to basically manage the system in those sorts of scenarios? So you can think of, let's say, source diversity as one resilience indicator that may, depending upon local conditions, be a factor that you should be incorporating into your equations. And that's more nuanced than, say, simple mass balance or water balance equations. So first is addition of resilience indicators. Those will obviously be included in the corporate guidance, or at least the broad categories of resilience indicators. Second is a greater emphasis on forward-looking conditions. A lot of corporate water stewardship work has been done previously looking at, let's say, historical data and current conditions. And what we really want to push for is forward-looking conditions. What are the types of shocks and stresses, as Kari was mentioning, that you could be encountering? What does the system need to do to be resilient against those shocks and stresses? So there's a bigger emphasis upon looking forward than there has been before. A lot of the historical water-related data, some of which WRI does develop, is really developed looking at the last 40 years. But we're really trying to push businesses to look forward more, do the type of stress testing, scenario analysis that's required to basically to operate in an increasingly uncertain future. Finally, Kari mentioned different types of resilient strategies. This is new. We're really pushing businesses to ask slightly harder questions about your resilient strategy. It's not just enough to be doing actions that reduce your risk. The real question is, how does this fit into your strategies? Are you trying to have a persistence-related strategy, adaptation, transformation-related strategy? And these decisions that each individual stakeholder may make about their preferred resilient strategy should help guide the types of actions that they select. So those are the three key points that I would say are being overlaid. Of course, definitely would like to have input as the publication comes out. If you are interested in review, it has not gone to review yet, or additional information on the publication, I recommend reaching out to Ashok. And then lastly, I will point out that we are moving into more of a piloting phase. We would be interested in piloting with partner companies. So again, reach out to Ashok or the project partners if interested. All right, Ashok, I'm going to give it back to you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Colin. Such a clear presentation of what's coming in the sector guidance document. With that in background, now I would like to invite Jason Morrison, President of the Pacific Institute and head of the CEO Water Mandate, to introduce and invite the panelists and moderate the panel discussion. After short scene setting by each panelist, Jason will further interrogate or help moderate the session and conclude the session with summarization of the panel discussion. And finally, remaining couple of minutes time, the session will be closed with the future milestones in the project. The floor is yours, Jason.
Thank you, Ashok. And welcome everyone, and greetings from COP. So, I'm very excited about this panel discussion we're about to have. For those of you that are familiar with water or water and climate adaptation, you'll know that we have some of the leading thinkers on the topic with us today. I just want to give you advance notice that all the questions that we prepared ahead of time, I'm throwing out the window, and we're going to have really hard questions. And along those lines, for those that are attending online, very much encourage you to use the chat function to bring forward your questions, and we'll get them into the dialogue as we move forward. So in terms of our panelists, we have 2 remote and 2 here with us on stage. We have Emily Wasley, Practice Leader for Sustainability, Energy and Climate Change at WSP. Will Sarney, Water Innovator, Water Foundry, and longstanding advisor on water. We have the Director General of IMI, Mark Smith, here with us in the room. IMI stands for the International Water Management Institute, has been leading research on water for decades now. And we have John Matthews, the Executive Director of AGWA, the Alliance for Global Water Adaptation. So as I said, this is an all-star panel. I'm really excited about this discussion. And the way that we're going to format this discussion is allow brief introductory remarks, where you have an opportunity to talk about how your organization has been coming at water resilience and how the WRAF links to your work. And then we're going to get into more interactive discussion once everyone had an opportunity to say their leading comments. So with that, let's turn first, Emily, to you to kick us off with your prepared statement.
Excellent. And thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this esteemed panel. I'm Emily Wasley. I work for WSP, which is a large multi-global engineering and infrastructure design company. We ourselves like to walk the walk. So we are a sustainable and resilient company, and truly are working at the cross marks of climate change and resilience. So the work that I do really focuses on working with water utilities and large publicly traded companies around the world to better understand their systems, what their underlying conditions are, and then identify how climate change will either exacerbate that or present new challenges to them. For years, we've been assessing the risks posed by climate change to different systems and operations. And this framework, the WRAF framework, really takes it a step further to get more into testing the resilience. So testing resilience is very different from testing risks. And testing the resilience, as Colin had mentioned earlier, really requires the understanding of the adaptive capacity of the surrounding area and the surrounding community upon which the system or the organization depends heavily. One example that I can provide is we work with a global technology company that has data centers around the world that requires water for cooling. And there are water stress areas where they have data centers, and they really need to understand and are actively working with those local municipalities and water managers to understand what is the water availability, the quality, and how can they actually replenish water in the areas that they are extracting that water for cooling. So really understanding what that resilience of this water system is, how climate change will exacerbate that over time and affect the system itself and the surrounding community requires true collaboration across the jurisdiction and across the organizations that are in that jurisdiction. Three components that I really love about the WRAF framework is the systems approach. As adaptation professionals, we're always thinking about how systems work interchangeably and are interdependent. And so really getting to this understanding of the system itself and what goes into the system, what decisions are required to operate a water utility or a company or a data center is really imperative to understand at the ground level. With that, then you can understand kind of how shocks and stresses may affect that system and then prepare for those shocks and stresses so they don't become a crisis. The other component that I love is that this framework can really be used to assess the resilience to any acute, chronic hazard. So climate change is one, water stress is another. You could think of cybersecurity as something that you could use this framework to really test your resilience. If you understand your system, you understand the decisions that need to be made to continue operating the system safely and thrive in the face of a changing climate or a chronic hazard, that will help your business overall. And then the fact that the third component is that this framework really gets to that transformational change that we need. We have been trying to shove adaptation into disaster preparedness or disaster response and recovery. We really need to transform our systems, our way of thinking, our behaviors, our technology to really be able to thrive in the face of these chronic and acute shocks and hazards. So that's a little bit about what we do and how I see this framework being used. We actually also conduct tabletop exercises and stress test systems. So would love to see a company and a community partner to really test this framework out and see how it can be used to help enhance the resilience of the system and the community writ large. Back to you, Ashok.
Fantastic. Thank you, Emily. I'm going to go directly over to Will. Please kick us off.
So, Jason, good to see you and some old friends and colleagues in the world of water. Ashok, if you don't mind just putting up my slides and I'll go through them quickly. Thanks for the opportunity to be here and participate in this discussion. And with that, I will just run through a few slides. Where I fit in the world of water is working with US and non-US multinationals on corporate water strategy, also innovation, technology innovation, but also innovation in new business models, funding and financing, and work with development banks and NGOs. So that's just from where I see the world of water. I did see in the document at least one reference to water and climate as wicked problems. So I jumped on that as a way to provide some input and some thoughts on the framework and the document, and perhaps open it up to a broader group of stakeholders that have an important role to play in solving wicked water problems. So next slide, please. This won't be a surprise to anyone. It's a rather simple way to think about what's going on in the world of water. It's overallocated and undervalued, poorly governed. We see that consistently, no matter where you are in the world, for the most part. It is non-circular, very linear approach in terms of extraction, use, and discharge. And there's nexus stress in terms of water, energy, and food manufacturing. The impacts of climate change make all of this worse. As a friend and colleague, Debbie Stowell, says often, it's a threat multiplier. And Debbie is at COP, so you may see her. So in thinking about, well, what has to change, this is a convenient way to start the conversation with multinationals and also entrepreneurs that are new to the world of water. Next slide, please. So a wicked problem. This is from Rattel and Weber's initial paper from 1973. The two key aspects of this that are important to me in the world that I live in is wicked problems hardly ever sit conveniently within the responsibility of any one organization. And I know that is well understood by my colleagues on the call today who are engaged in collective action initiatives. The last point here, some wicked problems are characterized by chronic policy failure. Unfortunately, water fits very nicely into this, and we see that consistently. Next slide, please. So, sort of the punchline here, who solves wicked problems? Well, everyone does. And this is a slide developed by a dear friend, Tom Higley, who started something called 10-10-10 and now X-Genesis. And it really highlights the qualities, attributes of each stakeholder group. We could play around with where these fit, either to the upper left or lower right. But generally, what we see is that entrepreneurs have speed and focus, but no scale. The public sector, lower right, great size and scale, but very little speed and focus. Everyone else sits in the middle, and corporations might sit a little bit further to the left or the lower right, and civil society sits across all of it. My point here is that in the document, we're really not engaging and thinking about entrepreneurs and investors that have a key role to play in solving wicked water problems, wicked climate problems. So as you think about where this document might go, I encourage you to think about how to engage with a broader set of stakeholder groups that are really very active, and I have some examples that I'll show you. Next slide, please. One more back. A couple of things that make the point is that there are a number of things that are going on in watersheds that are outside sort of the usual stakeholder groups. Colorado River Basin Digital Watershed Project that is with an entrepreneur, a startup, True Elements, and Water Foundry. It's essentially a digital twin of the Colorado River Basin and a Colorado River Basin fund that identifies technologies that address scarcity, quality, and access within the watershed and are doing their part to solve some of the challenges that we're facing within the watershed with respect to the impacts of climate change. And with that, that's my last slide. Oh no, one more. An illustration of digital water technology companies that are addressing challenges within watersheds. I encourage you to take a look at these companies. These are started by a number of really creative entrepreneurs that have an innovative approach to addressing some of the challenge we're facing. So with that, thank you, Ashok.
Great. Thank you very much, Will, for laying out water as the wicked problem. We're going to come back to that and the multi-stakeholder solutions for that. But first, Mark, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Jason, and thank you to the WRAF team for the invitation to take part in this discussion. A couple of reflections to kick off. So I think one of the things that the WRAF is very valuable for is we all talk about resilience in our communities these days, and especially at events like this. There's lots and lots of talk about resilience as an ambition and an aspiration, and the WRAF is going to help us move that into action, and that's using the WRAF to really catalyze a focus and attention on resilience, and then how we start working on it to make changes happen to move upward on that aspirational curve toward resilience, I think is a really critical contribution that the WRAF's made. I also really like the 3 strategies. So persistence, adaptation, transformation, I think that's a real addition to the conceptual thinking that'll help us move forward. And especially when you link that into the elements of the framework that are iterative, right? Because climate change means that the water system is unmoored now from its historical climate drivers. And so if you're on a persistent or an adaptation path now, well, in future you might need a transformation path. And I think this differentiation that the WRAF provides is very helpful in that sense. And then the iterative model is going to help us navigate that. So the final reflection I wanted to give relates to a framework that we use in IMI to try and organize our thinking on how we tackle the kind of wicked problem that Will is outlining, which really has 4 components, and they're nested. It's a nested framework, and the outermost of those components is governance and participation and networks, and the innermost of those components is technologies and infrastructure, and between that is data and information and nature-based solutions and so on. And most often, and I think this comes through in the WRAF as well, most often where people start is with the technology and infrastructure. What tools can I deploy to start fixing stuff, okay? Whereas I think where WRAF might provide the most catalyst for innovation is on the governance piece. And this aligns to what Will was just saying, because you really have a new set of stakeholders bringing in business, then has been very central to the dialogue about resilience before. And so there's an opportunity with new stakeholders, new networks, new coalitions, new partnerships, bringing together different kinds of actors, as Will's graphic showed us, that I think means that that may be the source of the innovation for resilience that we see coming out of the framework, the WRAF framework. Thank you.
Fantastic. I'm definitely going to circle back to that. But first, John, please open us up with your opening statement.
AGWA's been working on climate change and water issues for about 11 years, and one of the patterns that we've seen in our members and a lot of the people that are working in this space for a long time is that they already have an existing methodology that they're already using, that maybe they've developed internally, that they have something, like maybe Colin was mentioning some of the water stewardship guidelines and processes. And one of the things that we've worked with groups like the World Bank or UNESCO to develop kind of soup to nuts methodologies for how they look at climate risk, how they develop climate resilience solutions around water issues. But we realized that actually we were kind of missing a trick, because there were so many people that were already, that they had something that they were already using, and it didn't have that climate component. They needed an adjustment. They needed to be able to add this kind of climate perspective. And that was one of the things that we were really interested in with the WRAF, is that it was going to help them work within their existing system, say, you know, these indicators are very good for thinking about sustainability in terms of developing targets that are relatively fixed, that they help us think about a stable system. But most of us are now working in unstable systems, or systems that are becoming destabilized, and we need those extra insights that are going to help us bridge and add on to and do better a lot of the things that we tend to work on. So that was a really important component for us to focus on. And I want to just maybe as a last point, Emily she specifically called out this idea of transformation. Transformation is something that some parts of the world are already well advanced in. You can think about places like the Tibetan Plateau, about the Andes, the Himalayas. These are systems where there has been a lot of climate change very quickly, and it is really profound. The people there even feel very socially, even culturally disoriented in these places by the amount of change. And so they also feel very stressed with their electrical systems, their water supply systems, not just their social systems. Many parts of the world in the next 10 or 20 years are going to move into a transformation phase. We need to help the other several billion people move to think on that level. And to my knowledge, nobody is working on how we operationalize transformation thinking. And that, to us, was actually one of the most exciting things that we were trying in WRAF. And it's interesting that has also been one of the areas that people have really focused on as they read through. Thanks.
Thank you, John. Mark, I'm going to come to you with the first question, and I want to build off of a number of speakers that have talked about different aspects of this, and then try to bring it into a question that you talked about the insight around WRAF really opening up a new way of doing water governance. Emily talked about this idea that testing resilience is different than testing water risk. And Colin unpacked that, at least for the business community, on how we've historically thought of water risk and then how this starts expanding when you start getting into resilience. And she also mentioned that for adaptation professionals, it's always appreciated when you start thinking about how these systems talk to each other and how the interdependencies of these systems, whether it's your food system or your energy system, and how resilience is going to cause stakeholders to connect around how water connects to these other issues. And that means new stakeholders to the table. You know, this idea that it's not just new players like the business community that might be ready to sit down and have a conversation around how water risk manifests in a basin and how resilience is more needed, but different organizations that are connected to water through their own systems. And I want you to speak a little bit more about IMI's work and this role that you've had in getting a shared understanding of what the threats are, the stresses, and what resilience might do, and where you see that opportunity of bringing these different stakeholders together going forward.
Sure. In terms of IMI's work, we do a lot of the little framework that I outlined. For example, we do a lot of work on the data and information and tools part of that framework. So equipping people with information about drought and flood and forewarning and so on, right? So equipping people with data and information. One of the challenges that the WRAF framework gets at, and that our work it runs like a thread through our work, is you need to then connect that kind of information into enabling people to act, right? And then you start dealing with institutions. And one of the principles that we work toward in relation to resilience is we need to be empowering and enabling people to act really locally. And to do that, we need to connect them across scales, from higher level institutions through to very local institutions. So how do we have effective information and tools to feed through that system, and as you do, catalyze improvement in that system? And that's where I think some of these new actors can that maybe the WRAF is helping to bring to the table. That's where they can play a particular role. So we need actors that can move across scales. Maybe some businesses are better at moving across scales and carrying that information and that capacity and the convening and facilitating that you need across the different scales to enable people to act. Maybe if they're working in consortium with NGOs. Again, going back to Will's graphic, if they're working in partnership with NGOs, we can be more effective at doing that, and more effective at doing that more quickly, and doing so in ways in which, as everyone comes to that table and engages across scales, they're doing so with the kinds of tools that IMI works with, in a much more informed way, with information that's much more responsive to needs, and so maybe then the system can move faster. Yeah.
So thank you for that. Will, I am going to look for you to talk about your sense from the work you've done with corporates on their ability and appetite to do that engagement at the different scales. But first, Emily, let me turn to you and ask, as you've worked with many clients, audiences, customers, including utilities at a municipal level, what's your sense of the understanding within municipal utilities of both the appetite for bringing these new players to the table under this frame of resilience and their capacity to follow through. So it's an expansion of the domain in a way that's much broader than what I think historically stakeholders have done. And this notion of connecting stakeholders like corporates and or investors and entrepreneurs, I'm going to come back to that. But just where do you think that bandwidth is and the appetite from a utility perspective?
Great question. And I think there is increasing appetite for it from the water utility perspective. I know, the work that we just completed to develop a climate risk and opportunity mapping framework that actually works really nicely with the WRAF, aligns with the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. And there is an intention to do that. So that water utilities could start to get prepared for public disclosure and the other kind of assessments of risks and opportunities that a lot of corporates are now moving into. So if they have similar perspectives and have that kind of same language, they're able to partner together, to collaborate more significantly, and to come to the table with similar language and an understanding of what this process might look like. So the other component is that water utilities have for a long time, the water managers there have understood the need for multi-stakeholder engagement. And the work that we've been doing with water utilities more recently has been with the critical business functions that don't always think about climate change, don't need to think about climate change, but climate change is starting to impact their business function and their way of doing business on a day-to-day basis. So, for example, we engaged finance, we engaged government relations, we engaged engineering and enterprise risk management, so that we had the conversation within the utility with other leaders that were being impacted by climate change and could help come together to collaboratively identify solutions to manage those risks and adapt. We didn't get to the part of transforming, but with WRAF, because that was before WRAF came out, but with WRAF, we're excited to potentially pilot this with a couple of US-based water utilities and would love to see different companies that are also located in those jurisdictions to partner to see how they can actually understand what the collective risks are, the interdependencies, and then how to make that transformational change in an equitable manner. So there will need to be a transition to transform. It's not going to happen overnight. But we definitely need to be having the stakeholders in the same room, in the same dialogue, testing these solutions out and really pushing the needle on what can we do differently to survive in this changing climate.
Great. Thank you, Emily. That's really clear. John, I know AGWA has worked with multiple layers of government around climate adaptation and water resilience, and also increasingly with businesses. But for the first part, what's your sense of Mark's belief that the WRAF can really serve as an unlock for new conversations and real step change around water governance?
I think it's a huge opportunity, and part of it is actually because I think it can help foster the basis for a new shared dialogue. One of my favorite stories is something that I heard from a small NGO that's based in the Cape Town area in Western Cape in South Africa. And during the Day Zero crisis, one of the things that they really noticed was a kind of evolution that occurred, especially with businesses, but it had really important implications for kind of broader governance and civil society interaction. That businesses were a little reluctant to actually become, they were a bit of an obstacle early in the Day Zero crisis, and they were cautious. They were even a little angry at the mayor, at the utility. You know, how did you get us into this mess? You know, it's going to take us 10 years to build new infrastructure so that we can really increase our capacity. We're basically just here waiting for rain, and the government could do a lot, but it couldn't do everything. And so the kind of first, I would call it a defensive reaction on the part of business was to say, actually, the city's responsibility kind of ends where the pipe hits the building. And so they started to really look inside the building. Where is water? They look for the actual water that was in their systems. It occurred to them, there's all this virtual water. It's in our energy system. It's in our data systems. So for technology companies, it's present in our supply chains. And I think interestingly, like the reaction there is you want to start to build walls. When you feel defensive, you want to protect yourself, right? And so that was the initial response of these businesses. But near the end of the Day Zero crisis, Green Cape noticed something else that I thought was really special. They said that there were a few companies that said, actually, if our customers, if our clients, if our employees can't get water, then our business cannot function in the most fundamental way. That actually, when we build those walls to secure the water just for our institution alone, then we're actually making the situation much worse. And I think that kind of stakeholder engagement is real resilience thinking. And I would hope that that's also exactly where in the graph that Will was showing, in some of the comments that Emily was saying about what is it that we're assessing? Are we assessing risk on a kind of individual basis? Are we thinking about resilience in this kind of collective shared sense? We need to tear down those walls and make sure that we actually, if there's not water in that school, then there's not water in my business. And I actually need, as a secondary level, I need to be able to go to politicians, to decision makers and say, we need to invest in the system, not just take care of ourselves as individual institutions.
Great. So, Will, I signaled I was coming your way, and I want to frame the question in two parts, and I'm hoping that you can give a relatively brief question, because if time allows, I want to try to squeeze one more question in that's come to us through the chat function. But Will, you've done strategic advisory with corporates for decades now. What's your sense of the understanding and appetite for shifting from the water risk lens to a resilience lens, and which we know to be different? And then also whether you would think these same corporates would perceive the WRAF and as the ability to have an unlock around improve or step change in water governance. Over to you.
Yeah, I'll keep it brief, although it is the role of the public sector to deliver safe drinking water, and Day Zero is a little bit more complicated than just zero. So people that could afford water got it. Those that couldn't did not. So, John, a longer conversation. So, Jason, absolutely, there's an appetite to understand resilience and how to thrive, because, as you know, companies that don't have a supply chain, don't have healthy watersheds or healthy communities, really don't have a business anymore. And what I'm seeing is that there is that recognition. So the thinking around the WRAF adds a lot of value in getting companies to think about scenarios. And you also touched on something, an appetite for companies to engage with entrepreneurs and investors to drive innovation. Definitely see that in the 100+ Accelerator program that has AB InBev, Coca-Cola, Unilever, and Colgate-Palmolive, and also the recently launched PepsiCo Lab program. So definitely a shift towards really engaging with some unusual stakeholder groups to solve challenges, and the WRAF plays an important role in getting corporations and entrepreneurs and investors to think differently about water.
Ashok, I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative to forego my synthesis so that I can squeeze in another question. And it speaks to something that, Will, you said at the outset in your opening statement around how when you look at the RAF as it stands now, and even the planned work around targeting 3 key decision organizations, glaringly missing to you were financiers or investors and entrepreneurs. We also had a comment from someone online saying, you know, in sub-Saharan Africa, particularly in Kenya, what we need now is the financing piece of this. We don't need more frameworks for governance, but what's this going to do to accelerate the actual investments that are necessary to address the impacts of climate change when they're coming? So I'm going to open this up to anyone that wants to take this on, but how is this a blind spot of the RAF? And if it's not, how does this speak to those key decision makers that are important for solving a wicked problem? And I saw, John, you grabbed your mic, so that takes you first to the queue.
What I'll say is we need to make sure that we have projects that are really capable of seeing correctly the problems that we face. And I think one of the with a lot of the finance institutions, with actually a lot of the people that are working in climate adaptation, they may be in a situation where they're having slow, gradual changes, but they're effectively defining resilience as a kind of rebound situation. Or maybe they're in a situation where there's really profound transformational changes. I would argue that, say, like the image that Kari showed of the fires in California, you know, those forests are not growing back. Same thing in Australia. Those forests are not going to come back the way that they were. Probably going to be grassland. Like if your adaptation strategy, if your adaptation project is focused on that, it will fail. And I think one of the things that we can do is we're trying to actually help finance institutions be able to include through a tool like RAF the ability to differentiate good quality projects based on their ability to perceive these kinds of broad strategies of change.
Excellent. Thank you, John. This is going to be a speed round. Mark, I know you want to come in. I know also that your hand is raised, Will, and I'm hoping, Emily, you might have some closing remarks on this topic as well. Mark, over to you first.
Just very quickly. Yes, absolutely. Finance is important, and finance needs to drive action. And better governance helps deliver that finance, okay? But let's think a little non-traditionally about what we mean by governance here. And what we're really talking about is how to drive and manage change, right? And so it's governance in its broadest sense about institutions doing their job. So how do we catalyze and deliver and manage change? And then with reference to the person online, how do we do that radically? So it's not just about finance, but how do we use the finance to trigger and catalyze change that's radical and fast and fixes systems, or transforms systems, I should say. And to me, that's the problem space we're in at the moment, right now. Yeah.
Very good. Thank you. Will, over to you.
Yeah, just real quick. I would love to see the RAF be used to engage not financial institutions, but the investor community that wants to fund a promising startup or a growth stage company that solves a particular problem, such as real-time data acquisition and analytics. So there's a lot of technologies out there that are being deployed at the watershed level. So thinking differently about other stakeholders that we can bring into this conversation to be part of the solution.
And Emily, I see that you came live on the video, so over to you for a final comment.
Thanks. So I'll just add that I completely agree. Financing, adaptation and financing this transformational change we need to get to a resilient world does require finance. And I think there's the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures has a indicator in there about assessing resilience for corporations. So I think there's a nice connection there that will require corporations, NGOs, water utilities, public sector entities to come to the table together to really think about, they already have plans, how do we finance these plans? So we need to move forward in that space. Thanks, Jason.
Thank you, Emily. And thank you to our panelists for a great discussion. Really appreciate it. Ashok, over to you for the wrap up on next steps.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you very much. It's such a lively discussion. We wish we can extend the time for a couple of more minutes. Unfortunately, we don't have it. Thank you all the panelists and the speakers. I'm sure we can have a very engaging discussion. Unfortunately, we'll have to stop now. The next step in this project are to develop these 3 guidance documents that Colin mentioned earlier and to pilot the project. So we invite any interested parties or potential partners to explore further potential to collaborate. And I would like to thank you all the panelists and Jason for such a lively discussion. Thank you all. And the links are here for you to download the report and all the project information. Cheers.